Random House Audio presents Malice by Danielle Steel. Read for you by Jason Culp.
The sounds of the organ music drifted up to the sky. Birds sang in the trees, and in the distance a child called out to a friend on a lazy summer morning. The voices inside the church rose in powerful unison as they sang the familiar hymns that Grace had sung with her family since childhood. But this morning she couldn't sing anything. She could barely move as she stood staring straight ahead at her mother's casket. Everyone knew Ellen Adams had been a good mother, a good wife, a respected citizen until she died. She had taught school before Grace was born, and she would have liked to have had more children, but it just hadn't happened. Her health had always been frail, and at 38 she had gotten cancer. The cancer started in her uterus, and after a hysterectomy she'd had both chemotherapy and radiation. But the cancer spread to her lungs anyway, and her lymph nodes, and eventually her bones. It had been a 4.5-year battle, and now, at 42, she was gone. She had died at home, and Grace had taken care of her single-handedly until the last 2 months when her father had finally had to hire 2 nurses to help her. But Grace still sat next to her bedside for hours when she came home from school. And at night, it was Grace who went to her when she called out in pain, helped her turn, carried her to the bathroom, or gave her medication. The nurses only worked in the daytime. Her father didn't want them at night, and everyone realized he had a hard time accepting just how sick his wife was. And now he stood in the pew next to Grace and cried like a baby. John Adams was a handsome man. He was 46 and one of the best attorneys in Watseka, and surely the most loved. He had studied at the University of Illinois after serving in the Second World War, and then came home to Watseka, 100 miles south of Chicago. It was a small, immaculately kept town, filled with profoundly decent people. And he handled all their legal needs and listened to all their problems. He handled personal injury and claims against the state. He wrote wills and helped with adoptions. John Adams had been the town's football star as a young man, and he had gone on to play in college. Even as a boy, people had been crazy about him. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 16, and his grandparents had all died years before that, and families literally argued over who was going to invite him to live with them until he finished high school. He was always such a nice guy and so helpful. In the end, he had stayed with 2 different families, and both of them loved him dearly. He knew practically everyone in town by name, and there were more than a few divorcees and young widows who had had an eye on him ever since Ellen had been so sick in the last few years. But he never gave them the time of day, except to be friendly or ask about their kids. He had never had a roving eye, which was another nice thing people always said about him. "Lord knows he has a right to," one of the older men who knew him well always said. "With Ellen so sick and all, you'd think he would start to look around. But not John. He's a right decent husband." He was decent and kind and fair, and successful. The cases he handled were small, but he had an amazing number of clients. Even his law partner, Frank Wills, teased him occasionally, wanting to know why everyone asked for John before they asked for Frank. He was everyone's favorite. "What do? Offer them free groceries for a year?" Frank always teased. Frank was a good researcher and good with contracts, with minute attention to detail, but it was always John who got all the glory, whom they asked for when they called, whom clients had heard about from miles away in other towns. Frank was an unimpressive little man, without John's charm or good looks, but they worked well together and had known each other since college. Frank stood several rows back in the church now, feeling sorry for John and his daughter. John would be all right, Frank knew. He'd land on his feet, just like he always did. And although he insisted now that he wasn't interested, Frank was betting that his partner would be remarried in a year. But it was Grace who looked absolutely distraught and shattered as she stared straight ahead at the banks of flowers at the altar. She was a pretty girl, or would have been if she'd allowed herself to be, At 17, she was lean and tall, with graceful shoulders and long, thin arms, beautiful long legs, and a tiny waist and full bust. But she always hid her figure in baggy clothes and long, loose sweaters she bought at the Salvation Army. John Adams was by no means a rich man, but he could have bought her better than that, if she'd wanted. But unlike other girls her age, Grace had no interest in clothes or boys, and if anything, she seemed to diminish her looks rather than enhance them. She wore no makeup at all, and she wore her long coppery auburn hair straight down her back, with long bangs that hid her big cornflower blue eyes. She never seemed to look straight at anyone, or be inclined to engage them in conversation. Most people were surprised by how pretty she was, if they really looked at her, but if you didn't look twice, you never noticed her at all. Even today, she was wearing an old, dreary black dress of her mother's. It hung like a sack on her, and she looked 30 years old, with her hair tied back in a tight bun, and her face deathly pale. "Poor kid," Frank's secretary whispered, as Grace walked slowly back down the aisle next to her father, behind her mother's casket. Poor John, poor Ellen, poor people. They'd been through so much. People commented from time to time on how shy Grace was, and how uncommunicative. There had been a rumor a few years back that she might even be retarded, but anyone who had ever been to school with her knew that that was a lie. She was brighter than most of them. She just didn't say much. With her mother so sick, she had barely even wanted to go to graduation. But she had, of course, and she had shown her mother the diploma as soon as she got home. She had been accepted at the University of Illinois, but had deferred it for a year, so she could continue taking care of her mother. Her father wanted it that way, too. He felt that Ellen preferred Grace's loving touch to that of her nurses. Grace hadn't argued with him. She knew there was no point. There was never any point arguing with him. He always got what he wanted. He had been too good-looking and too successful for too long. He was used to it. "Couldn't you have worn something decent for a change?" her father asked with a look of irritation, as they drove to St. Mary's Cemetery on the outskirts of town, with 3 dozen cars behind them. He was a respected man, and he had a reputation to uphold. It looked strange for a man like him to have an only child who dressed like an orphan. "Mama never let me wear black, and I thought I should." She looked at him defensively, sitting miserably in the corner of the old limousine the funeral home had provided for the occasion. "Is everything ready at the house?" he asked, and she nodded. For all her shyness and reticence, she ran a home beautifully, and had since she was 13. In the past 4 years, she had done everything for her mother. "It's fine," she said quietly. She had set everything out on the buffet before they left for church, and the rest was covered on big platters in the refrigerator. People had been bringing them food for days. "She was a rare woman," John said quietly, and now, thinking of her, he glanced over at his daughter. She was such a beautiful girl, and so determined not to show it. That was just the way she was. He accepted it, and it was easier not to argue about it. She was good about other things, and she had been a godsend for him during all the years of her mother's illness. It was going to be strange for both of them now, but in a way, he had to admit, it was going to be easier now, too. He looked out the window as they drove along, and then back at his only daughter. "I was just thinking about how odd it's going to be now without your mama. But maybe—" He wasn't sure how to say it without upsetting her more than he meant to. "Maybe easier for both of us. She suffered so much, poor thing," he sighed, and Grace said nothing. She knew her mother's suffering better than anyone, better even than he did. The ceremony at the cemetery was brief. Then a crowd of 150 friends came and went at the house, and when the last of them finally left, Grace loaded the glasses and plates into the dishwasher. There was a lump in her throat, and she was trying not to cry. It had been an awful day for her, an awful year.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?